The wayfinding landscape is changing, so welcome to Endpoint's Wayfinding Xchange Podcast. We want to connect with leading experts, tech innovators, and key contributors to exchange knowledge and innovation in physical and digital wayfinding. We want to shape the future of wayfinding through discussion, collaboration, and shared expertise. And this is why we have created this podcast series. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to Endpoint's Wayfinding Xchange Podcast, presented this time by me, Alison Richings, Wayfinding Design Director here at Endpoint. Over the years, I've faced the challenges that listed and special buildings present to those of us that design signs. The panic rises, but to be fair, so does the passion, when we think about the impact our signs might have on these special places. And we also think about how we might balance that with the needs of people navigating these spaces. In this episode, I've come to the National Theatre, a modernist architectural masterpiece. Only completed in 1976, the building was given a Grade 2-star listed status within 18 years of its inauguration. I am here to discuss the challenges special buildings bring with Paul Jozefowski, the National Theatre's Head of Building Design and Environmental Sustainability, who I think it's fair to say has lived, breathed and nurtured this building in various roles for the last 41 years, culminating in his current role in 2017. I want to ask Paul what it is that makes this building so special. How do you go about maintaining it? And what are some of the plans for the future? So welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for joining me and taking your time to speak to me today.
Well, that's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start with you. So you are the Head of Building Design and Environmental Sustainability. What does that entail? What's that like?
Well, it's two roles. I mean, sometimes they overlap. It's a fairly new role for this organisation. I was appointed to it about 5 years ago. The Head of Building Design is something that I inherited following a project I worked on as a co-director on a refurbishment project called NT Future. That started around about 2010, 2011. It was a very long-term project of refurbishment, about £83 million budget, and it lasted several years because we didn't close the building. My role there was to work as an interface between the architect and the various stakeholders around the building. And I learnt a lot about the building during that time. There was quite an element of sustainability in works that took part as part of the project as well. So I also learnt about sustainability quite a bit. And then I took a sabbatical, having been here quite a long time, and it was quite an exhausting project. When I came back, they asked if I would take on this role. The building design is I act as an internal consultee if people want to make changes, temporary or permanent, around the building. It's a protected building, as you mentioned. It's Grade 2-star listed. We have a conservation management plan that acts as a guide. And I'm really the go-to person to talk to who can interpret that guide. And once people have come up with some ideas or suggestions, then I can say whether or not they would be acceptable, because it has to go through a process. We have to talk to planning authorities and statutory consultees. And then on the environmental sustainability side, my job was to take most of the work that happened in NT Future was on infrastructure. My role then following that was to change the culture of the organisation and put sustainability at the heart of it.
Amazing and challenging, I imagine. Sitting as the person who is the keeper of the rules, and also sitting with the authorities that get involved because of the listed status. Mm-hmm. That must be quite challenging to try to get what you think is absolutely right for the building through any kind of project.
Yes, particularly now. You mentioned actually in your introduction that the building was listed quite shortly after it was completed. And the reasons that happened were quite interesting. It was because we were about to complete our first refurbishment project. So the building had been open 6 days a week for years and hardly closed. It was in need of repair. There were things that weren't working, things were breaking. And there was a lottery project that was one of the first ever lottery funds that were released that we managed to get hold of to do some changes. But Dennis Lasdon, the architect, was still alive and wasn't very happy about some of the proposed changes.
Not that architects are ever precious.
Exactly. And I mean, the building, he suffered a lot during this construction of this building. He was pilloried at the end of it in a way. It was not a loved building when it was completed. It was, where I say it's very different now. But he got wind of a few changes that people wanted to do. So he was the person who moved to get it listed. So in a way, the listing then was to stop too many changes, was to save the integrity of some of the design. And for years, that is how listing buildings are seen. It's preserved. But the planners now are much more open to changes in buildings when they realise they're living, functioning buildings. They can't be in aspic all the time. So they have to be able to live and to grow and to adapt to the changing world. So it is challenging when we want to do it. Part of the challenge is that it's a creative organisation. It's full of creative people. They want to make their mark on things. They want to change things. The concrete is not so giving and not so sort of it doesn't allow them to do as much as they think they can do without damaging it, and or going against the grain of what the conservation management plan means. So although it's challenging, we have a good relationship with the planners, and I think we can do quite a few things. We understand where we can flex on things, and we understand what they will allow.
And I suppose, you talked about the architect briefly. I wonder if you could give us a little bit more about the design of the building, because obviously Lasdon had a scheme that he wanted to create. He only used a certain amount of materials. I wondered if, just so that people have got a flavour of what the building's like if they've not been here.
Yes, well, it's quite helpful to understand that actually it was conceived as two large buildings. It was an opera house and a theatre. And originally it was meant to sit in front of the Shell building, so quite sort of next to County Hall, in fact. That was the original site. And then, so they designed an opera house, and they designed a theatre. The opera house fell away, partly due to lack of funding, partly due to lack of interest from the then National Opera Company that was to move in there. So in a way, what they did actually is they cut the building, they cut the design they had in half, because it was two symmetrical structures, and they kept one side of it, and then the site was moved to where we are now, and then that sort of half symmetrical structure was then there was a way of redesigning it to make it link to Waterloo Bridge. But in some ways there are certain aspects of it that seem odd, and it's partly because if you saw the original model, you'd understand why some things look like they did.
Yeah.
But it's made of poured concrete, so it's from a distance, it just looks like grey concrete. But as you get close, you understand that actually all of the structure is made from planks of wood that have been formed into shapes and concrete poured into it. So as you get up to the walls, you'll see the different characteristics and details of wooden planks. And the wooden planks were reused several times, about 3 or 4 times, and then discarded. But the whole structure was poured into mould. So it's a hand-built structure, which most people don't actually appreciate.
Yeah, and I think that's quite incredible. And I think you're right. I don't think people appreciate it.
And Lasdon, he loved concrete. I mean, I said he was in a way vilified at the end. I mean, it got quite sort of negative reviews. It came at a time shortly after a couple of buildings had collapsed. Concrete buildings had gone up in the 60s and they'd collapsed. There was a movement against concrete. Had it opened when it was meant to, it probably would have been okay. But there was lots of delays during the 70s. There were strikes. There was industrial disputes. There was the shortages of materials. So it dragged on, and it was one of those buildings that you sometimes see around London that never seems to finish. And this was one of them. And it was in such a prominent space. That when it opened, there was quite a movement against it. Also, it was a little isolated. I mean, now we're surrounded by things happening, but at that point, it just sat on its own on one side of Waterloo Bridge with a car park either side of it. So it didn't look so good. And I think it's taken a while for people to appreciate what he was trying to achieve. And there's some beauty in it. Its simplicity. There's a warmth in it if you look at the close-up detail of the wood. But he used a limited palette of materials, so it's sort of not shouty. It's very, very subtle. His wife, in fact, designed some of the interiors. She designed the carpet, which is a little controversial because people can't believe it's part of the listing now, so we can't change the carpet. But it's the idea of the building is that it's sort of It's a geological structure. It's like a rock face or a cave. You go into a cave to see the magic of theatre, as he called it, the word. And he wanted to put something solid around the word so it wouldn't be disturbed by the city outside. But he wanted it to be part of the city outside. So he put levels and walkways on it what he felt would be like a street scene. And it would be full of people. And that didn't quite happen for quite a few years because, as I said, it was so isolated. But there's very simple use of very pure, simple materials and a very simple aesthetic in large foyer spaces that works really well.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think that on the most part, people have really warmed to the building? Or do you think that it's still... Because at one time I remember reading that it had sat on the most hated and most loved list at the same time of buildings in the UK.
I think there are some people who will never love concrete. But, of people I know, I've spoken to people who come here who love coming here. They love the fact they've got great big spacious foyer. Some of them have got cars, can park in the car park, which when the building was open, that was a big thing.
Yeah.
Much more controversial now, have a car park in your theatre. But, and they had space. They didn't have to queue for so much for the toilets, didn't have to queue for the cloakroom, didn't have to queue to get a drink in the interval. Yeah, they love that, but they still can't warm to the concrete. But I think on the whole, it is more light than it has been. I think that was partly helped in the 90s when we relit it, and at night time we introduced coloured lighting in the evening, and it became more of a more iconic. It became, you could change the look of the building. I think people noticed it even more then and warmed to it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But I also think the usage of the South Bank has changed a lot in that time. I mean, I remember coming to the South Bank when I was much younger in the 80s, and I was going to the BFI, and just the walk from Waterloo to the BFI felt really quite grotty, and there was Cardboard City, and and it was a very, very different place. And I think that as everything around it has also changed, that probably helps people feel that the building itself just sits there really beautifully doing its thing.
One of the challenges when it opened, and one of the things they wanted to address in the 90s when they did the first changes, was the fact that the Riverwalk at the front stopped because it was built just for the theatre, and then there was just a warehouse next door. So that the front really just faced the bridge, and they added in the third theatre, but it put it around the back because it was a sort of a last minute decision. It didn't link to the front. So you had to get past the bins and the waste area and the goods in delivery to get to it. And then there was a road. I said there was a car park. A road ran around the whole building. Although it was trying to be this democratic building for the people, Lasdun still talked about how you could drive up in your car and drop off your wife and then drive back down to the car park and meet her in the foyer.
That's very democratic.
Yes. And he said you would drive up under the porte cochere, which is what all opera houses have,
Absolutely.
For the horse carriages. So, it was this sort of rather mixed aspect of it. We tried to address in the 90s. We got rid of the road and linked it more to the riverside. There's a big refurbishment project, but it completely missed. It was just too early for that millennium, the changes of the millennium, when the London Eye went up, Tate Modern opened, the walkway, and then the walkway, which had been completed in the 90s, was suddenly being used. And it's now, we're told, up to 14 million people a year walk along that South Bank. It's for most visitors who come to Britain or to London, the South Bank is on the top 10 list. Just walking along the South Bank. Most people don't know what's along it. It's just the thing that you do. You take a walk along the South Bank. So that has changed it completely. And those changes we did in the 90s, some of them, they didn't address that aspect of the change of people coming from the east as well as the west. So the NT Future project tried to address that by just opening up the whole of the frontage of it and making it much more pedestrian friendly.
It's totally amazing. I mean, it's got an incredible history. And I wonder, because obviously you have to be fit for modern purpose. So, this building is going to be used by different people in different ways. And, you need to make sure that everyone can access what they need to. And, there's lots of modern things. I know 1976 wasn't that long ago, but even so, things have changed. And I wonder if there's ever any issues around this idea of trying to modernise the building or change the building in any way that feels incongruous to its listed status and its special building.
Well, one of the first aspects that was challenging was to make it open and accessible was that it wasn't accessible for people in wheelchairs, and that wasn't really thought about. And it's complicated. It's a complicated building because it has lots of levels that are not connected by lifts. And in fact, there's two buildings. There's the Littleton Theatre side and the Olivier Theatre side. People don't realise they're coming into two. They think they're coming to one theatre and they can find any of the theatres in it, and they're not. They're three theatres, and the levels of the Littleton and the Olivier are different, and the Orphan Theatre is completely around the back and somewhere else. So so it's very challenging, and trying to make it accessible has been problematic.
I can imagine. But also, I can imagine for navigation, when we talk about wayfinding, that's really problematic. And when you've got a building that is so special, and when you've got concrete that can damage so easily, it must be really challenging when people talk about the need to put signs up on a wall or do things like that.
It's a constant conversation.
I was going to say, is it?
It is, and it will be, and it will never be resolved.
No.
I know you're probably thinking, I'm sure we can resolve that.
But
I don't think it can. I've
right.
seen it. I've been here a long time. I've seen every attempt.
Yeah.
And it's insurmountable because of the way he's designed it. It's not navigable in a very. There's no logic.
Oh, you're just throwing down the challenge to me now.
First thing he wanted it to be a porous building, so he put entrances everywhere.
Yeah.
And you could come in at any level. We don't do that for security reasons. That's not quite the case now. We push everyone through the main entrance at the beginning for security reasons. But once you come in and you look around, it's a wonderful array of levels and vistas, but it's not very clear where anything is or how to get there. Yeah. So when the building first opened, everyone was very upset by that. That was one of the biggest complaints. The lettering, the wayfinding lettering, was beautifully designed. It was a wonderful polished metal with a little arrow that pointed you to the theatres, and that was it. You got to point each of the theatres, but it sort of set you off in a direction, but never really. If there was a wall there, that he decided he could put one on, but he wouldn't put it on another wall. It wasn't great. Plus, also, they wanted to create an atmosphere in the foyers, a theatrical atmosphere. So everything was very darkly lit. So it's also difficult to see your way to everywhere. And he talks about the theatre being in the back of a cave. And it is, if you think about it, the foyer, the windows are very large at the beginning, and then the ceilings get lower and lower, and then and right at the back, you'll find the theatre, and if you're lucky, you'll find the toilets. But they're hidden, and that was a design concept. That was deliberate. Now, we could solve everything. The biggest way to solve everything was to put great big toilet signs everywhere, because that would be the first thing that would solve everyone's annoyance. Not the theatres, it's the toilets. Anyway, but in the 90s, with the first changes, they colour-coded it. And each theatre had a colour, and they colour-coded the tickets, and no one spotted it. They hadn't worked it out. No one realised it was colour-coded. They just saw big signs, and they put these signs, the signs where you could slide in things and change it. So you had these massive signs which had about 7 things you could slide in that were never used or went out of date quickly. And
no one ever changed them.
Yeah. So we revisited that for NT Future, and we just simplified it right down to people are coming to the theatre. So we just sign the theatres first as you come in. But they're also coming to see a show. Most of the time they don't know what theatre they're coming to. They know what show they're coming to. So we put little poster frames on the stair signage. We put poster frames so they could see the poster for the show. And then when they come in, we project the show name on the first thing they see as they come in. There's an arrow pointing right or up, because that's the 2 big areas you can go. And then the Coslow the Dorfman Theatre, is slightly more problematic. But we have greeters at the front because they're there all day. When we did our how are we going to sign this, or how are we going to do? We stood at the main entrance just before 7 o'clock and watched an incoming. And I've never seen so many bewildered faces. I thought a lot of people would know where they were going, but they might know where they're going when they came last time to see that show in any other theatre 6 months ago, but they don't remember. And we stood there, and a couple of us had our sort of like official-looking work phones. And the minute they saw someone with a phone, they went straight up and asked for directions. So now we have them there. We have security as well at the moment searching, but we also have 1 or 2 greeters during the day, and then several greeters in the evening to point people up, because they run in at 7:15, 2 minutes to 7:15. They're panicking, they haven't even looked at their ticket, and they just need help, and they're not going to look at a sign.
No.
Are they going to look at the sign and read it wrongly?
Yeah, exactly, because they're stressed and they're like, I need to get in there.
Yeah, and then we reintroduced the slightly more atmospheric lighting, but we have lit the toilet signs. Well, the toilets are not in a logical place, So, but we didn't want to put huge, great big graphics of it because we can't do that. So we've accepted it, and we just, we just aiding visitors now with the greeters and slightly simplified signage.
And is that sort of really where you try to kind of land, where there's always this balance between actually you could put big signs everywhere, but what would that do to the building? So we go a bit more discreet, but we make sure there's people. So you're balancing off one thing against another. And do you feel, particularly the role around sustainability, that that's what you have to do? It's a constant balancing act.
I'm not going to say we're fixed on that, because there's been a lot of changes since, and there's now some movements. I mean, the bane of my life are pop-up signs.
Yeah, they're the bane of my life too, just so you know. If I could remove every temporary sign in every building I've ever been in and get paid £1 for it, I'd be a multi-millionaire now.
Or if someone could design a nice looking...
No, just stop doing it. Just don't do it.
But sometimes you just need it. You will need it. You can't have someone standing there. There's a one-off event. It's. I've spent my life since the Anti-Future project traveling around the world. I never stopped looking at signage and temporary signs, and no one's got it right. And I don't think there is a way of getting it right. It's because something's always going to change. I think it's just a necessary evil. You just got to try and keep it under control.
It's all about the control.
Yeah. But we have, at the moment, we've just opened 2 new restaurants. We just refurbished those. And of course, the people who run the restaurants, they want to have some special signage, and they want to people aren't coming because they can't find the restaurant,
But I think that's also quite an interesting challenge, in the sense that spaces like theatres, because this theatre is no different in some respects to some of the other spaces. It's open from 10 o'clock in the morning. That doesn't mean there's a performance on from 10 o'clock in the morning, but you can come in here and you can spend time and you can enjoy it. And you could come to the restaurant, or you could come for some other reason, visit the shop or whatever. And that's all revenue generation, which is really good. But you also have to find ways of pleasing all of those different revenue streams. And that can be challenging, because that just adds more pressure.
Well, there is the pressure at the moment. There is a pressure. We put some digital signage in, and there is people fight to get their aspect of the business on the digital signage. So you have the marketing department really want to promote the shows, the commercial department want to promote the bookshop, the restaurants want to be they want to be promoted. So it's tricky, it's complex to meet all those needs. Digital signage is something that, when we looked at it in 2010, I went to Amsterdam for this there's a very big digital exhibition space on there, and everything was on the actually no, it was just at the tail end of 3D, and they'd been wasting all their money on 3D, and it was just tailing off. And we were looking for something. There wasn't anything that suitable. We found 2 large screens that we put above the main entrance that were fairly effective and fairly bright, but we knew that later on down the line something else will come along, and I think we're getting now close with some of the digital displays that you can put in front of glass or behind glass, and then when they're not on, you can see through the glass. And I think we might start looking at things like that, but they're very expensive, so we're not going to come in straight away. And it's just, we have to see how the planners feel about it. I think that's going to be slightly more controversial. Just big, bright digital displays are not liked on a lot of listed buildings.
Of course. And it is really interesting how the digital world changes everything, and how it impacts, because most theatres and arts institutions have moved into that more digital space with digital screens and all sorts of different things. And it's really hard if you've got a listed building, because you want to be modern. The building's really modern, so almost it's like, well, surely more innovation is a good thing in that space. But equally, there is that difficulty where you've got a series of planners who might say, well, I'm not sure about that. Is that one step too far?
If we did look at having some large digital screens along the riverside in 2010, and we were sort of advised informally, council wouldn't look at that. There's added complication that you're not allowed to advertise along the River Thames, which a lot of people don't realise.
No,
there's no adverts. If you look, there's no billboards, there's nothing along the riverside. So this is where the Oxo Tower is quite famous, because it was a way of advertising without actually being an advertisement. It's a crafty way of getting the brand noticed. We put our digital matrix sign up in the mid-'80s. Not sure that we got planning permission for it. And it's again a not rather Marmite thing, but if you go onto the Lambeth Council website on advertising and you read through, it talks about it actually singles out the South Bank as a special, because it's a conservation area, and advertising on the South Bank as being a special area that they look at differently. And it mentions that sign and says this should not be taken as being allowed anywhere else in the borough. So it's sort of been allowed to remain, but
it's actually
that's
it's
it.
got
You can't.
A black mark against it.
Yes, it has, and we have. I mean, and it's a big at the moment. It's a big digital stream, but we only use it as the dot matrix because that's what it originally was. We can't make it anything else. We can't put a big, massive, HD all singing, all dancing screen up there. It's just recreating what was put there in the 80s.
Because the listed status is such, isn't it, that it has to stay the same. It becomes a part of the listing, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Because we had that. We did a project for Harrods, and we had that issue where there was a lot of people who felt that the Egyptian escalator that had been put in by El Fayed didn't fit that well with the rest of the building, but they couldn't take it out because it was listed as a part of the rest of the structure. So there's all sorts of little things in planning rules that you can fall foul of. How do you plan for improvements in a building like this? I mean, obviously, you sit in this role where you act as that consultant. Do people come up with a plan and then kind of come to you? Do you get brought in right at the start? How does it work?
It's as I said before, it's a very creative organisation. It's full of people with lots of ideas. People are constantly coming up with ideas, but also the executive changes every decade or so. And with the executive comes new plans and master plans. So, we don't do huge long-term planning in that sense. It tends to be in smaller bits. But yes, I mean, they would come up with a plan. What we would normally do is informally talk. I would look at it and say, well, if that's acceptable, well, would that get through planning? And the next thing we do would just informally talk with the conservation officer at Lambeth. And he would give us advice on that. And if it is going to move forward, then we would, depending on what it is, there are other consultees that we also have to talk to as well. Some areas they will be more interested in than others. So the other consultees are the 20th Century Society, Historic England, and the Theatres Trust. Theatres Trusts are predominantly interested in what we're doing on the stages and around the theatres. But the 20th Century Society are very, very interested to know what we're doing to the building itself and to the shape of the building. So we would end up talking to them, and we'll go through the planning process. There are areas where we don't have to go to planning if we're changing furniture. They can be more relaxed in certain areas that are less visible. If it's back of house changes, they're not as interested. It's the more public spaces,
of course,
that they're very interested in, and it's the more highly known areas, so the most visible areas, so the main foyer areas. But if you go into one of the restaurant spaces, they're less concerned about some of the changes there. We've managed to do more there because they're isolated and they understand they need to change to the way that restaurants are, and then the restaurants don't always stay the same design. That they will change every now and again. So there's a balance. So sometimes we would talk to them about that, but if it's just furniture around our backstage areas, but even if we're doing some temporary things, we will have to talk to them. For our summer events, we have to present plans for that. Any changes to the building, hanging anything on the outside of the building, we talk to them about.
What's been the biggest challenges? Because I imagine that there are some things that I would think of as massive changes that could be really challenging, but then I can imagine with such a special place that there could be small things that you could say, well, actually, that's too much of a challenge to this building. Can you think of any examples?
Well, for me, the biggest thing is anyone wants to attach anything to the concrete.
Yeah.
The concrete
we fell foul of that with our donor board. Yeah. So, yeah.
The challenge there is that although it seems like a very solid material, it's quite delicate and vulnerable. It's not very resilient. The board marking, the texture isn't very deep. So if you were trying to clean it, there's a danger you wear down the texture, particularly externally. If you want to clean it, there's only so many times you can't really pressure wash it because it will just take off layers of the concrete. Externally as well, it's aged differently on different aspects of the building
because of the weather.
With the weather.
Yeah.
So if you come around to then repair it, the colour of the concrete and the texture is different in different areas, and even inside it's most of the people in the past when we've tried to do concrete repairs, they're very visible. Now heritage people don't always mind that. They if you were to look at Big Ben, the Tower of Big Ben at the moment, they've just recently taken down all the scaffolding. You can see big clumps of where it's new stone, and they haven't tried to weather it in or match it, and they'll say eventually over time it will wear in. But it's not as easy to do that on our concrete, and in some areas where we've taken signage down, it looks in some areas like someone's got a machine gun and peppered it, and we've just tried to fill it in very badly, because the concrete, there isn't the skill set of repairing. So there's skill set for repairing things like heritage buildings that are made of stone, and Georgian buildings and brick buildings. There's very little experience yet on how to do concrete.
I hadn't thought of that before.
Because there aren't that many. Most of them have been knocked down since all the car parks that were built, all the other buildings that weren't liked have gone. So no one's really been looking after them. So
because on a very personal level, I live in Milton Keynes for my sins. Judge me however you wish. Our shopping centre has been listed, and of course it will have that same type of problem because structurally it's all glass and steel and coated, and it's not a stone traditional building.
Yes, you can't cut out a piece of stone and the concrete is, if it cracks or breaks, and you can repair it, but it will be very visible. It's a big challenge. It's a challenge that's becoming more problematic for us now as it's getting to its 50th anniversary, and we're going to have to start looking at how we can address some of it, and I think we're going to have to look at different ways of doing it. For example, for years we've had a real problem with graffiti, and of course there's a lot of graffiti in this area. They celebrate graffiti in some areas. We don't celebrate it on our building, but every now and again somebody decides they're going
to celebrate it on your building,
and we clean it off, but it really does damage it. But we did talk to some of the statutory bodies about putting a coating on it, but they wouldn't let us because they said it would change the look of the concrete, and no one knows what that will look like in 20 years' time. It could damage it. And that's the same way with the repairs. It's we just don't have the historical evidence to prove or to help us know what to do with it. So that's the biggest challenge.
So that
challenge means I tell people no a lot when they want to make a hole in the concrete.
Yes.
Because I don't want to leave that legacy of someone else as having to, look at all those horrible marks and that damage.
That's actually mind-blowing. And that idea of legacy and that idea of, in 20 years' time or 40 years' time, what will have that done to the structure? And I suppose for some of those things, you end up being damned to whatever you do because somebody will come along and graffiti the building, and you will have to find a way of getting it off, which will damage the building. But is that less of a problem than if you coated it? And maybe you don't know until 20 years' time. So that's really interesting and a complete impossible challenge. So you just have to navigate it in the best way you can. Yeah. So when you're thinking about materials for any building projects, how do you balance that aesthetic and sustainability? Because you sort of end up having, I guess, both hats on. It's like you want to make sure that this fits with this beautiful building. You also want to make sure that it maintains a level of sustainability that will, carry on for. Well,
there's two ways of looking at it. You've got the foyer spaces, and it's definitely much more restricted what you can do in the foyer space. I talked about Lasdun's limited materials. So you've got the concrete, you've got this blue-black slate brickwork on the floor in some areas. You've got the carpet. Then you have stainless steel, black leather on the banquette seating, and then finally the Wengi wood. That was one of the biggest features, actually. Wengi is now, you see that in office furniture everywhere. It's called Wengi, but it's not anymore because you can't. It's a tropical hardwood, so you can't
so it's
source
faked
it.
now, isn't it?
It's faked, and we're having to fake it as well because we can't buy
No.
it. So we recreate it usually with oak and stain the oak and try and match it as much as possible. But we try and keep within that palette in the main foyer areas and not add anything more. The furniture you can play around with and be colourful, but everything else is slightly more limited. We've done a little bit on the bar fronts that we played around a bit more because originally they were a rather very 70s sort of green and brown melamine, which I try and avoid, and we try and use more natural materials now. We're trying to avoid plastics as much as possible. We would look at the embedded carbon in the products that we're using as much as possible. Back of house or less sort of public areas, we're a bit freer, but that's where the drive for me, well, the drive for the organisation will be cost, the drive for me will be sustainability. I'm trying to marry those two up. It's getting easier now. It was more complicated with the NT Future project 10 years ago. There wasn't as much choice, but so many more companies now are producing sustainable products. Though you have to do a lot of investigation. There's a lot of greenwashing around. You just need to check out, look deeply into it and test it. Don't take everything for granted.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I think we see that in what we're doing, that sustainability is tough. It's not easy. How do you deliver beautiful design solutions within a budget? Because I'm imagining, we talked to Catherine earlier. She talked about how the building is funded. I'm imagining that there's a budget and then you've got to step outside of probably what most people would think of as standard approaches because you're having to deal in this environment when you talk about the foyers in particular.
Well, it's challenging, but it's not my challenge. So I'm the person who just
it just says no,
yes or no to it, or that looks good, or it doesn't look so good.
Yeah.
So it's the challenge for the designers. It is tricky, and it is problematic in the main foyer areas because they're not cheap materials, and it adds to cost. But in the other areas, more in the restaurant areas and the furniture, I think they've had a bit more of a free hand to do things. And we know that, I think we accept now that the interiors are going to change commercial interiors tend to change every 5 years, but I don't think that's sustainable. I'm so hoping that we design things that will be nearly 10 years. But they get so much use that they wear out, that nothing is made anywhere as strong as it used to be. That's one of the other problems, and this is where sustainability comes in, but it's the one area of sustainability which doesn't help my job, is the finishes on materials, because we're not using solvents anymore.
Yeah,
everything's water-based. Materials don't have the longevity that they used to have. They don't last as long. The glues aren't as good as they were because they're not using animal byproducts and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So there's really great improvement in the sourcing of materials, but it hasn't helped for the lifespan of those materials.
Yeah, I mean, it's so challenging.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, just like on a personal note, what's your favourite place in this building? I know it's a really difficult question, but you have such passion for it. If it was a day when it was really quiet, there's hardly anybody here, and you could just go and sit anywhere and enjoy it, where would you go?
I'd sit in the main foyer by the Littleton and look around, because you can look up and see up into the restaurant, you can see up into the staircases. You get a real sense of the theatre of the space. It's almost like a cathedral, that height. I studied Gothic architecture when I was younger, and so it's a modern Gothic building in a way.
Absolutely.
With those huge soaring columns. That will be the place to sit. But when it's busy, I'll go up. There's a level, the Wolfson Gallery level, where there's a sort of a way of looking down. And this is Lasdun said that the foyers with the fourth auditorium. You can stand up there and look down and just see everyone moving around. It's great fun.
And of course, they probably don't notice you either. So you get this perspective that's almost private, but, because you're the only person looking down and they're not looking up.
And he designed these things deliberately that you could see across and see from different vistas. And he talked about it being like looking through the narrow streets of a city and thing. And, he was quite romantic about it. But I think he got it. It works. In some of the spaces, it really does work. Has that effect.
Definitely. And then what's the future? What's the next big thing? I mean, you said obviously about the age of the building now, and therefore there's going to be some requirements to maintain and upkeep it. But are there any future plans that?
Well, yes, we're at the moment, we've invested over the years. We've invested quite a lot. when the building opened, it was at the forefront of technology. So it was for theatre particularly. So it was the forefront of stage lighting. It had the first computer-controlled stage lighting, power flying systems, the elevators, and this moving the scenery, all of that stuff. And over the years, that's all had to be replaced. And we've invested huge amounts in the stages. We present the best work with the best creative teams. So we've always got the newest lighting, the building in a way has sort of like not taken as such an important funding role. So there are elements now it's getting to 50 that we're going to have to start investing in. So we're now looking at major capital investment plans in the next few years that will address the structure, the building itself, but also sustainability is the next big thing that we need to be looking at. We need to improve the insulation of the building. We're going to have to get rid of fossil fuels, so we're going to have to heat it differently, which means we've got to insulate it better. So we're going to look at photovoltaics on the roof, air source heat pumps, putting double glazing in. At the back of the building where all the offices are, that most people won't notice, it's on the southern and eastern side of the building, are single glazed windows where there are 400 people working in offices and they're freezing cold in the winter. But it's a listed building, so we're looking at budgets of 10 to 15 million to replace glazing. It's huge. It's a huge investment, but I think that's what we're going to be looking forward, because it will help us also get to net zero, because it will end up using less energy to heat the building and to cool the building. So that's, yes, so there are big plans that are being looked at the moment. We just need to find some funding for it.
Well, that's always the tricky thing.
Yeah.
But it's an incredible project to try to bring down the carbon usage of the building. I mean, you know, it has an economic value as well as a sustainability
It does,
value.
and we're talking. I was at a meeting of the cultural institutions that the GLA called the other day, and it's interesting because we're going to have to take on another role as climate change happens, because our foyers are beautifully warm in the winter and air conditioned in the summer, and these places that people might want to come to when the temperatures are outside change. And it's happening in America now, where they have places where in the southern states they have big public buildings that are open to people to go and keep cool when they can't keep cool in their homes. There's elements of that I think will come to the fore as well, so it makes it even more of a public asset in a building.
But I think that's also really interesting. In the 1940s, when everybody went to the cinema, a part of the reason to go was that obviously it was very cheap, but it was really warm.
The same with Victorian pubs were the same thing.
Yeah.
The Victorian pubs were like a home. They were done up with lovely carpet and nice big furniture, roaring fires. People didn't have that in their own homes.
And it seems really strange to us in the world that we live in today, that the idea that in a way it'll swing back round to that, because people will seek out places that are air conditioned because climate change will mean it's too hot in the summer, and places that are warm in the winter, and the whole challenges that bring is really interesting.
And the irony being, of course, we're a big concrete building, so as you approach us, we will be absorbing a lot of the heat and giving off a lot of the heat. Although the riverfront is great with the trees, and it's very, very cool, and we are looking to improve the biodiversity around the rest of the building just to try and cool it down.
But that just blows my mind, the way it all kind of goes around and comes around. It's quite incredible. So thank you so much for your time today. It honestly has been really, really fascinating, and how you make a building that is so huge, really sustainable and fit for the future is really interesting, but still hold on to the qualities from when it was built. And I really love the fact that people love it now, because I grew up in the 70s and everybody was really shocked about the idea of brutalism, and I secretly really loved it. And I really like the fact that people love it now. And I think that has also helped it to be an even better institution, because everybody talks about how great it is. And your passion comes across really, really well. So thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I know I mean, the building is fantastic. It's a joy to work in. It's a very happy building. I know some buildings sort of, you can go in it and it just doesn't have an atmosphere. But it's even in the backstage areas where it's not the most wonderful design, you see people smiling and happy. It's got a really good positive atmosphere. So it's a joy to work in.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to our latest Wayfinding Xchange podcast. Stay tuned for further episodes and feel free to contact us with any questions and suggestions for future episodes.